For 30 years, Margaret lived in the same two-bedroom apartment in Glendale, a suburb of Los Angeles, where the smell of toasted bread in the morning mixed with the sound of the kettle whistling in the kitchen. She had been working since early as a caregiver for the elderly, doing other people's laundry at night and on weekends, looking after neighboring children to supplement her income. She had no luxuries, nor time for herself, but she never complained. Everything was for Eisen. Adopted when he was just 4 months old, after being left at the door of an orphanage with a serious heart murmur, he became her reason for living. Margaret was 38 at the time and was certain no one else would care for that baby with the same devotion as she did. And so she began a lifetime dedicated to the mission of protecting, loving, and nurturing that boy. That very morning, 30 years later, she had woken up earlier than usual. She had spent the night awake, mentally rehearsing how to break the news to Eisen. The hospital where she worked as an administrative assistant was closing its doors. Massive layoffs. It was no surprise, but it hurt. Not because of the job itself, Margaret had done everything in life, but because she knew it would shake the stability of the home. That home, by the way, was hers, although it was in Eisen's name as an old gesture of trust. She had raised him with what she had and what she lacked. It was the day to tell him, hoping for at least a hug, maybe a word of support. But when she saw him coming down the stairs, with his dress shirt a little rumpled and his expression always preoccupied, she realized that day would not end as she had imagined. Take advantage of being here and subscribe to the channel. This story is still going to move you. Margaret waited until he finished his coffee. She stood at the edge of the kitchen, her hands trembling as she held a still warm mug, trying to appear steady. Eisen barely noticed her presence, as if she were already just part of the background of the house, like the clock that no one else adjusted or the old living room rug that everyone walked over without noticing. When she finally announced in a gentle voice that she had been laid off, she expected at least a look of concern. She didn't even get that. Eisen huffed, pushed his plate aside, and said bluntly that it was complicated. Nicole, his wife, entered the room right after, drying her hair with a towel and holding her cell phone, and she caught part of the conversation. Far from being moved, she simply let out an "oh no," laden with disdain. And that was when Margaret realized she was alone. Alone inside her own home, in the midst of two people who were supposed to be her family, but who now saw her as a problem to be solved. The following days were hard, but not for the reasons she had expected. Margaret wasn't afraid of being unemployed. That was well known. She had already scrubbed hospital floors and cared for Alzheimer's patients, without even having a day off. What hurt was the tone with which Nicole suggested solutions. One of them was to work as an assistant to a wealthy elderly person in the city in exchange for housing and a small salary. Another was to move to a nice, with activities and all that retirement home. Margaret listened to this with a knot in her throat. It wasn't just the absurdity of the proposal, it was the coldness, the way they spoke to her, as if she had lost the right to be someone. One day, when she mentioned that she intended to retire, something she had been quietly planning for months since she received the formal notice about the trust left by her former employer, Eisen laughed sarcastically. He said that she couldn't afford to live like a madame, and that if she refused to contribute, maybe it would be better to leave the house. Besides, Nicole added, the house is technically Eisen's. Margaret felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. She didn't argue. She simply went to her room, closed the door, and cried silently, sitting on the edge of the bed that she had paid for in installments 22 years ago. The next morning, Margaret got up early, as she always did, but this time she didn't make coffee, didn't set the table, and didn't leave the newspaper folded next to Eisen's favorite mug. She sat on the porch with a blue-covered notebook and a ballpoint pen almost out of ink. She began writing down names, old bills, dates, everything she remembered about the years. She had supported that home alone, She wrote as if stitching the edges of a wound. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt that she was seeing the truth. It was no longer about her son, about being understood or recognized. It was about herself, about reclaiming what she had given away without measure. She remembered Donna Beatrice, the elderly employer for whom she had worked for nearly 15 years. A woman with a gentle way of speaking and eyes that saw beyond appearances. It was she who, before dying, had signed everything, a fiduciary trust of more than $8 million, designated exclusively for Margaret, for the dedication, loyalty, and affection with which she cared for her until the very last day. Margaret had never told anyone, not even Eisen, not out of fear, but by choice. She wanted him to learn to live based on principles, not on expectations of an inheritance. But now, after everything, that reserve had become more than a guarantee. It was a chance to start over. At the end of that week, Margaret hired a lawyer. Without saying a word to Eisen or Nicole, she initiated legal proceedings to reclaim the house she had bought and whose documents were, out of trust, in her son's name. She also began looking for properties in upscale neighborhoods. She wanted something discreet but solid, a space that translated her new phase. When she visited an old mansion by Lake Toluca, with huge windows and a wooden floor that creaked underfoot, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. She signed the contract that very day, paying in full with no discount, no warning. After 3 decades living for others, Margaret decided to live for herself. Eisen only found out that his mother had moved when he received, by official notification, a summons to attend the eviction hearing. He was indignant, tried calling, sent curt, almost offensive messages. "What are you doing? This is ridiculous, Mom. Are you losing it?" Margaret didn't answer any of them. For the first time, she chose silence as her response. She was tired of explaining the obvious to those who never wanted to listen. While he fussed, trying to understand what was happening, she organized her new house with an almost ceremonial calm. She arranged the books in alphabetical order on the living room shelf, hung the old pictures she had kept for years, and set up a small garden on the side of the yard. Every gesture carried a taste of freedom. She no longer had to ask for space in the refrigerator, nor listen to veiled hints disguised as concern. At last, she was at peace. The hearing took place on a grey morning, one of those that seemed to reflect the weight of the moment. Margaret arrived with her hair tied in a simple bun, wearing a navy blue suit that she had sewn herself in the days when she even economized on thread. She was serene. Eisen, on the other hand, arrived late, nervous, accompanied by Nicole and an expensive lawyer. They tried to argue that the house was a gift and that Margaret had transferred it of her own free will. But the judge, upon analyzing the bank statements, the old renovation receipts, and the payment proofs accumulated over more than 2 decades, had no doubts. The property was hers, period. As she left the courtroom, Margaret neither smiled nor celebrated. She simply took a deep breath, as if saying goodbye to a story too long to be celebrated with fireworks. She drove home slowly, listening to Nina Simone on the radio, and for the first time felt that the past was starting to lift from her shoulders. In the days that followed, Margaret noticed something curious. The silence that once hurt like abandonment now seemed like a warm blanket. She began walking every day around the block right after breakfast. Sometimes she greeted the neighbors with a timid wave. Other times, she simply watched the street's movement with attentive eyes of someone who, for decades, hadn't had time to notice anything. She bought a battery-operated radio at an antique fair and placed it on the porch while watering the plants. Gradually, she rediscovered the pleasure of simple things: the smell of bread coming out of the oven, the sound of rain on the roof, the pleasure of eating alone without having to share the last piece to please someone. She was rediscovering what it meant to live without fear of bothering others. And the further she distanced herself from her old routine, the more She understood that all of that, the so-called home, the family, was, in truth, a place where she only fit if she completely diminished herself. But the tranquility did not last long. An old friend, a former colleague from the hospital days, sent a surprise message. "Did you see what they are posting about you?" Margaret was puzzled. She didn't use social networks, had never been interested. She asked her friend to send screenshots. And there, in the middle of a page with more than 20,000 followers, she saw a photo of her son smiling with a caption that made her stomach twist. "My mother abandoned me after everything I did for her. Now she lives like a millionaire and I, trying to rebuild my life with honesty." The text continued with distorted details, isolated phrases taken out of context, and a story retold as if he had been the victim of a cold and greedy woman. Margaret felt a pain she couldn't name. It wasn't sadness. It was a kind of public betrayal, as if she had been exposed in a town square and stoned with no chance to defend herself. Messages started coming to her cell phone, even though she had recently changed her number. Some with insults, others with veiled threats. "You should be ashamed. How can you abandon a child like that? Greed kills, you know?" Margaret couldn't understand how so quickly the narrative had turned against her. Nicole, with her performative manner and magazine model smile, appeared in videos crying, saying that they had taken Margaret in until the very end and that, for love, they had never revealed the elderly woman's emotional turmoil. It was all staged to perfection. They had found an audience hungry for scandal stories and villains ready for cancellation. Margaret watched everything with a lump in her throat, not out of fear, but out of helplessness. She knew the truth was different, but how to prove it without seeming vengeful? How to speak without being told she was only defending herself because she had been unmasked? It was on a rainy afternoon, with the sound of raindrops tapping on the window glass, that she made the decision. She opened the old laptop she kept in the desk drawer and created an account on a social network. She didn't know where to begin. She had never been good with cameras or public words, but she decided that she would tell her story from the beginning, without attacks, without scandals, just the truth. She gathered documents, old medical records of Eisen, school receipts, photos of notebooks that she had copied by hand in the early hours to help the boy study. She recorded audio of recent conversations in which he and Nicole suggested that she become a luxury maid so as not to burden the household budget. She published everything calmly, without sentimentality, without embellishment. "My name is Margaret. I was a single mother to an adopted boy with health problems, and I dedicated 30 years of my life to him. This is my story." In less than 24 hours, the video had already reached over 50,000 views. The comments began to change tone. People who had previously called her a freeloader now wrote, "This changes everything. She seems so sincere. Sorry for judging without knowing." Others started investigating on their own, retrieving old posts from Eisen, where he boasted of trips, luxury watches, expensive dinners, all apparently financed by the life he claimed to have lost. Nicole deleted her profile. Eisen locked the comments. But it was too late. The damage was done. The audience, once thirsty for scandal, now demanded justice. Margaret's evidence was irrefutable. The audios, especially one in which Eisen said, "You should be thankful that we still leave you here, old lady," went viral on denunciation pages and on profiles of psychologists who talked about emotional abuse in family relationships. Margaret had, unintentionally, become a symbol of a cause. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it now and hit the bell so you don't miss the next stories. It was then that the defamation lawsuit took shape. The lawyer she had hired for the eviction proceedings suggested that they move forward, mainly because of the profit Eisen had been making off the false story. Followers, partnerships, donations, all based on a lie. Margaret hesitated. She did not want to destroy her son, despite everything. There was still a remnant of old affection there, almost instinctive, but she also knew she could no longer allow kindness to pass as cowardice. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later. During that time, she kept to herself, tending the garden and watching the developments in silence. One morning, while out buying bread, a man in a blue cap recognized her and said, "You're Margaret, right? I saw your video. What a story, what a woman." And it was there, on that random corner, hearing the sincere voice of a stranger, that she understood that the shame was no longer hers. At the conciliation hearing, Eisen appeared different. He was dejected, with dark circles under his eyes and wearing a suit that clearly was not tailor-made. Nicole did not accompany him. According to backstage rumors, the couple had separated after the collapse of their public image. Margaret arrived accompanied by her lawyer and exchanged not a word with her son. She sat silently, looking straight ahead as the lawyers spoke. Eisen tried an emotional speech saying that everything got out of control and that he never imagined people would take it so seriously. But the judge was direct. There was malice, there was an intention to profit, and there were damages. The request for compensation moved forward, and Eisen's face, once confident, arrogant, public, now resembled that of a man exposed, surrounded by a truth that he himself helped to build and destroy. After the hearing, Margaret returned home in silence. The city remained the same, the traffic still jammed, the horns impatient, but within her, something had changed. For the first time, she didn't feel guilty. She didn't feel small nor fragile. She turned on the radio, took off her shoes, and sat looking at the living room ceiling as if watching the sky after a storm. All her life, she had tried to do what was right, thinking that it would guarantee respect and love. But there, lying on the sofa of her new house, she understood that sometimes doing the right thing also means protecting yourself. She made chamomile tea, put on her worn-out slippers that she had carried with her from the old house, and laughed to herself. Not that sad or resigned laugh, but a short laugh, almost like relief, as if finally she stopped chasing something that never depended solely on her. Over time, Margaret's story left the social networks and ended up on small local interview programs. At first, she refused all the invitations. She didn't want to become a tragedy celebrity, but she agreed to talk with a community radio journalist who asked her questions with respect and genuine listening. The episode had an unexpected repercussion. Women of all ages began writing to her, sharing similar stories, asking for advice, thanking her for the first time, showing someone setting limits in love without guilt. Margaret was surprised. She started answering some messages at night carefully. She didn't want to appear as a guru or a victim. She only wanted to make it clear that no matter how much you love someone, no one is obliged to be an eternal support. For someone who only knows how to drain you, it was liberating to say that out loud, especially realizing that so many people felt the same, but never had the courage to name it. Gradually, the idea of selling the mansions began to take shape. Not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to close the cycle lightly. One was already rented to a couple of architects. The other was sold to a family with 3 children who ran through the yard on the day of the visit, as if the place were already theirs. Margaret watched the scene with a smile from the porch, drinking cinnamon coffee. There was no bitterness, only the feeling of a mission accomplished. With the profit from the sales, she bought a smaller house in a quiet village by a lake in Oregon, surrounded by trees and silence. She took with her only the essentials, a few old pieces of furniture, books marked with handwritten notes, a photo album with images that she herself developed in a cheap lab in the 90s. She left behind everything that wasn't hers, including the need to be validated by those who had never truly seen her. The new house had a wooden deck that opened directly onto the lake. Margaret spent hours there, reading, sewing, or simply watching the reflection of the water change color as the sky changed. She made friends with some neighbors, simple people who spoke calmly, who were not interested in social media nor knew details of her story. It was exactly what she needed. On Wednesdays, she participated in a small reading group at the village library, where everyone brought a book and a piece of cake. On Fridays, she tended to the flowers in the community garden. She rediscovered the pleasure of cooking just for herself, of going to the market at a leisurely pace, of having a routine without rush or demands. On Sundays, she wrote letters that she never sent. She only put on paper everything she no longer wanted to keep. It was a way to empty her heart without hurting anyone. Despite the peace, there were days when the past returned like an unexpected tide. Sometimes, when folding a shirt, she remembered the hours spent sewing clothes for Eisen out of donated scraps. Other times, she dreamed that he was small again, sick, vulnerable, calling for her. She would wake with her face wet and take a while to understand it was just a memory. She no longer felt anger, nor a desire for revenge. She only felt the weight of time and the awareness that not every love returns the way one expects. Once, she found an old notebook in which she had written encouraging phrases to stick in his lunchbox. "You are strong. Mommy believes in you. Today is going to be a good day." She read them all in silence, then tore out each page and threw them into the fireplace. It was a ritual of farewell, not to her son, but to the expectation of one day being recognized by him. Over the months, Margaret discovered an unexpected taste for photography. She bought a second-hand analog camera at a thrift store in the neighboring town and began to document the daily life of the village. The lady who sold apples at the fair, the fisherman who always forgot his cap in the same spot, the fog that covered the lake on cold mornings. She developed the photos on matte paper and stuck them on a wall in the corridor, next to handwritten notes with small observations of the day. It wasn't art, it was living memory, a way of saying, "I was here, I saw that, I felt that." She created a small, unpretentious blog where she posted one photo a week and wrote a short note about the scene. To her surprise, she began receiving comments from people all over the country, touched by the delicacy of her images. "Your look reminds me of my grandmother's," wrote one follower. "There is something cozy in your words." Margaret wasn't seeking an audience, but she couldn't deny that it warmed her heart. After so long being ignored or treated as a burden, it was comforting to be heard without having to shout. One Saturday afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. There was no sender, but the envelope was familiar. Inside, there was a single folded sheet with handwriting that she recognized immediately. It was from Eisen. The message was brief, almost cold. It said that he had lost his job, was facing financial difficulties, and that he hoped she was well. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a vague tone of helplessness. Margaret held the paper for several minutes, trying to understand what it meant. There was no anger in her hands, no haste to reply, only that old certainty that now became even clearer. Time heals almost everything, except what the other refuses to see. She did not reply to the letter, not out of pride, but because she finally understood that she owed nothing more. She had already given everything she could: time, affection, shelter, opportunities. And now she was giving herself the right not to return to the point from which she was wounded. Instead of writing a response, she went out for a walk. The air was cool, the sky gray, and the streets almost empty. She took a deep breath. She had learned to identify when someone was coming in search of shelter or redemption, and she knew it was no longer her obligation to offer either. Days later, Judith asked if she had replied. Margaret shook her head serenely. "Not out of malice, but because I finally understood that not every bridge needs to be rebuilt," she said. They continued their conversation about a new event at the community center, as if that decision were just part of the routine, and it was. Margaret's life no longer revolved around Eisen, nor his absence. It revolved around the present, the smell of cake baking, the flower that finally bloomed, the book left on the sidewalk with an anonymous note. These were the small miracles of her day. and she wouldn't trade them for any vague promise, any remorseful wave. She had learned that one does not live on a corrected past. One lives on a constructed present, day after day, with conscious choices and firm limits. At New Year's, the village organized a small celebration by the lake. Nothing grand, simple lights hung from trees, live music played by locals, and a communal table with homemade dishes. Margaret brought her famous corn cake with fennel and arrived wearing a floral dress she hadn't worn in years. She was greeted with warm hugs and sincere laughter. She sat next to Judith, and together they watched the fireworks reflected on the water. When welcoming the new year, Margaret made no promises nor envisioned grand plans. She only wished to remain light. She had spent far too long carrying others' burdens. Now, she just wanted to continue with a peaceful soul. It wasn't little, it was enough. While most people counted down to midnight, Margaret looked at the sky and for the first time in a long while, felt gratitude for being exactly where she was. Not because of someone else, not as someone's support, but simply as herself. Strong, whole, available only for what also did her good. When the fireworks ceased and silence took over the lake again, she closed her eyes and thought of all the women who, like her, took too long to understand that they deserved more than mere survival. She thought of the little girl she once was, who used to read secretly at night after work, dreaming of a life that seemed so far away. And she smiled, because, in some quiet and unlikely way, she had made it. The journey wasn't beautiful all the time, but the destination finally made sense. A few days after the new year, Margaret received a package in the mail. There was no sender, only her name written in handwriting that she immediately recognized. Inside, there was a small wooden box, identical to the one she used to store important documents. When she opened it, she found some old photos of her with Eisen at different stages of his childhood, and among them, a crumpled note. The message was brief. "Sorry for everything. I don't know how to fix it." She read it slowly, with the calm eyes of someone who no longer expected anything. That, in a way, was the closest thing to an apology she would ever receive. But there was no intense emotion, no tears, no outrage, only a respectful silence for all that had been. She carefully folded the letter and stored it in a wooden box where she kept important things. Then she made some tea and went back to tending her plants, as she did every day. That same night she wrote in her notebook, "Forgiving is not forgetting, it is remembering without carrying." That was it. Margaret harbored no grudges, but she was not deceiving herself either. She knew that Eisen still carried within him a void that perhaps he would never have the courage to face. And that was no longer her problem. What once hurt like abandonment now only seemed like a choice to preserve herself, to not insist on a bond that was sustained only by her part. She continued writing a few more pages without hurry. She thought about turning that notebook into a new book perhaps, but there was no rush, no rigid plans. Margaret now lived in the right time for things, and that time did not demand immediate answers, only presence. And that, she learned, was the most beautiful way to move forward. As the days went by, Margaret started holding small writing workshops at the community center. The idea emerged casually after some neighbors asked for help to record their memories. She taught patiently, encouraging each one to write in their own way, without fear of making mistakes. "Write as if you were telling a friend," she would say. In a short time, the group grew. They were women of different ages and stories, all with something stuck in their throats. Margaret helped them transform memories into words, pains into paragraphs, silences into punctuation. And the more she listened to those narratives, the stronger she felt. She realized that her story wasn't the only one. It was just one among so many of mothers, daughters, sisters, caregivers, who learned to dim themselves to keep others shining. During one of those workshops, a woman named Naya shared a text about how she had been expelled from her own home by her grandson. She recounted in detail what she felt, how she tried to justify his actions, until the moment she realized that she no longer needed to explain herself. When she finished, she looked at Margaret with teary eyes and said, "If it weren't for you, I would never have had the courage to tell this." Margaret held her hand for a moment and replied firmly, "You are not alone." Those words echoed through the room like a collective embrace. It was then that Margaret truly understood what she had built. It wasn't just a new beginning, it was a network, a space where other women could also rebuild themselves, recognize themselves, and set themselves free. And in that environment of listening and sharing, she felt that everything she had lived had finally found a higher purpose. One Saturday morning, Margaret received an unexpected invitation from the City Hall, an honor for the social impact of her writing project. The recognition came with a symbolic medal and a small event with residents and family members. At first, she hesitated. She had never done what she did to receive trophies, but Judith insisted that she accept, not for the medal itself, but for what it represented. And deep down, Margaret knew there was something beautiful in allowing herself to be recognized. On the day of the event, she wore a light blue dress that she had sewn herself. When she stepped onto the small stage, she looked at the audience and saw so many women with whom she had shared stories, tears, laughter, and courage. She spoke little but firmly. "I used to think my life was about pain. Today I know it was about strength." After the ceremony, a group of young people approached her to take photos. They were studying the project in a journalism course at the local university. Margaret found it curious. Seeing her story transcend generations was something she had never imagined. One of them, a young man with curly hair and a camera hanging around his neck, asked how she managed to speak about her own life with such clarity. She thought for a moment and replied, "It took time, you know. But one day I realized that telling is different from reliving. When you tell, you organize. When you relive, you get lost." The young man noted it in his notebook and smiled as if he had just heard something precious. Margaret left the stage with a peaceful heart. She didn't need anything more. Everything that came after was a bonus. And at that moment, for the first time in a long while, she felt whole. On her way back home, Margaret and Judith walked slowly, chatting about the event. They stopped for coffee at a new bakery that had opened on the main street. While waiting for their orders, Judith remarked, "It's funny how things work out, isn't it? You came out of a storm and built a clearing." Margaret smiled, stirring the sugar slowly. "Yeah, but first I had to drown a little to learn how to swim," she replied, half laughing, half serious. That was how she now saw her own journey, not as something that destroyed her, but as what shaped her. And in that process, she discovered a strength she never knew she had. There they were, two women who had survived different versions of the same struggle. The struggle to keep going when everything seemed to pull you back. The coffee arrived steaming and they toasted without a word. They only knew that that moment was worth it. That night, back at home, Margaret looked in the mirror and saw herself differently. There was nothing extraordinary in the reflection. The same graying hair, skin marked by time, a serene look. But there was something there that hadn't existed before. Pride. Not a vain or loud pride. It was a calm, intimate pride of someone who knows she came far without stepping on anyone, without losing herself. She walked to her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing what would be the introduction to a new book. A more personal project, perhaps longer, in which she could explore in greater depth everything she had lived, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to record it, for herself, for those who would come after, for those who needed to know that it is possible to survive neglect and still flourish. She typed for an hour, then saved the file under the name Clearings. In the following days, Margaret returned to her quiet routine. In the morning, she tended the garden. In the afternoon, she wrote. And at night, she read until she fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the trees. Farrell, her feline companion, now slept at the foot of her bed, purring like a watch that marked the calm of the days. Life, at last, had found a pace that didn't demand haste. During one of those silent afternoons, she received a visit from Clara, the young woman she had taken in months before. Clara arrived smiling, with an orange cake wrapped in a dish towel and the news that she had been accepted to a college for psychology. "I want to help other people free themselves from the stories that bind them," she said. Margaret was moved but didn't show much. She only held the young woman's hand and replied, "You've already started." Inspired by that reunion, Margaret decided to write about Clara in her new book. She wouldn't use real names, but she wanted to record the strength of that new generation that was also learning to protect themselves. She began to devote more time to the project, writing every day, even when inspiration seemed to be lacking. She knew she didn't need to be perfect, she only needed to be truthful. She started visiting small bookstores in nearby towns, observing how people chose books, what attracted them, what made them stop and flip through a page. It was as if she were rediscovering the world, but now with more attentive, more generous eyes. Margaret was no longer seeking refuge, she was building presence. And in that process, she realized that writing wasn't just a way of telling her story. It was also a way to keep herself alive, even on days when everything seemed too quiet. As the book took shape, Margaret began revisiting old memories with a different perspective. She went back to some stored boxes, found letters she never sent, notebooks with scribbled budgets next to recipes for homemade medicine, drawings of Eisen made with crayons. Each item brought a fragment of who she once was, and now, looking at it all from a distance, she realized how much she had grown. She no longer felt that sharp pain when remembering. It was like watching a movie you know well. You know the ending, you understand the ups and downs, and yet you still respect every scene. In one of those rescue sessions, she found an old diary with daily notes from the time when she worked 3 shifts. On the yellowed page of some Monday, she had written, "I'm tired, but I still believe it's worth it." Margaret smiled. It had been worth it. On a sunny Sunday, Judith organized a lunch at her house and invited some friends from the village, including Clara, the people from the community center, and even the couple of architects who had bought one of the mansions. It was a simple afternoon, full of good food, free laughter, and light conversations. At one point, someone asked Margaret how she would like to be remembered. She thought for a moment, then replied, "As someone who chose her own peace, even when the world screamed otherwise." The group fell silent for a few seconds, as if that phrase had gently landed in everyone's heart. It wasn't a rehearsed answer, it was pure truth, because Margaret, more than surviving, had learned to exist fully. And that was, deep down, her greatest legacy, not the money from her former employer, nor public recognition, but the ability to rebuild herself without losing tenderness. Margaret never heard directly from Eisen again. From time to time, she would catch a rumor here and there, vague news brought by acquaintances, that he had moved to another city, that he was working as a freelancer, that he avoided social networks since the lawsuit. She didn't nurture curiosity or rancor. She only truly wished that he had found a path that didn't involve hurting anyone. She knew that some bonds, no matter how deep they seem, do not survive a lack of reciprocity, and that was okay. Not every love needs to last to be true. Margaret had loved with everything she had, and that no one could take from her. Sometimes, while walking alone by the lake, she would briefly think of him, as if recalling a story that had already ended. And she moved on, light, without carrying what wasn't hers. One cold afternoon, while sitting on her porch with a blanket over her legs and Farrell curled up beside her, Margaret finished the last chapter of her new book. She read it aloud just for herself, savoring each sentence as if it were a serene farewell to everything that needed to be said. When she finished, she closed the notebook slowly, with a lump in her throat, not from sadness, but from completeness. It was as if, by putting a period to that story, she was also closing a chapter within herself. She decided not to rush the publication. She wanted to let time work, as she had learned to do with everything in life. She looked Again at the lake before her, where the sun was setting, tinting the water golden. That image, so simple, seemed to her the best definition of peace. Margaret didn't want anything more, just to keep living with dignity, respect, and the freedom that had taken so long to conquer. On a crisp autumn morning, Margaret woke with a sudden desire to rearrange the furniture. It was something she did from time to time, almost like a renewal ritual. She moved the bookshelf, dragged the sofa, and hung new pictures with handwritten phrases. While organizing the objects, she found an envelope with printed photos from the exhibition she had held at the community center months earlier. In each image, there were faces of women smiling, hugging, reading their own texts aloud. That evoked warmth in her chest. She decided then to print more copies and send them as gifts to each of them, with personalized notes. It was a small gesture, but full of meaning. Margaret knew from experience that sometimes what saves someone's day is precisely the reminder that they were seen with affection. Soon after, she received emotional responses. Some letters came with drawings, others with recipes, others with accounts of achievements those women had reached since they started writing. One of them, Nair, wrote that she had resumed her studies and now helped other elderly women learn to read. "You made me believe that there was still time," said the last line of the letter. Margaret wept while reading, but it was a good cry from someone who feels that they planted something and saw it bloom. She kept all the responses in a cardboard box she affectionately called proof that it was all worth it. That exchange, so simple and genuine, made more sense to her than any public recognition, because there lay the essence of what she had always sought, to care, but now in a way that also cared for herself, without burden, without demand, without imposed silences. One quiet Saturday night, Margaret decided to watch an old movie that she used to watch with Eisen when he was a child. She made a simple popcorn, draped a blanket over her legs, and let the living room light go out, with only the glow of the screen illuminating the room. During the first few minutes, she felt a pang in her chest, as if that gesture took her back to a time when everything seemed easier. But gradually, that nostalgia gave way to a different feeling: gratitude. She no longer needed to run from the memories. She was no longer a hostage of what she had lived. She could look back and recognize that even with the pain, there was love. And that love, even if it wasn't reciprocated as she had expected, was not wasted. It had shaped her, taught her, and in the end, strengthened her. After the movie, she sat on the sofa and picked up the hardcover notebook where she recorded loose phrases, reflections, snippets that could one day become stories. She wrote, "The greatest freedom I found was not having to be understood by those who never tried to understand me." She read it quietly, repeating it to herself as if sealing a truth. She closed the notebook, made some tea, and went to sleep with a serene heart. Margaret knew that the outside world would continue to be noisy, unpredictable, full of injustices. But there, in the small universe she had built with her choices and limits, there was peace, and that was what mattered. She no longer needed to prove anything, correct anything, recover anything. She was finally living for herself, and that, after everything, was the most silent and just victory she could achieve. With the arrival of winter, Margaret began to go out less. The intense cold left the streets empty, and the lake seemed to freeze along with her thoughts. But she didn't feel alone. Farol accompanied her through every room, and the letters from the writing workshop continued to arrive, warming her mornings. In one of them, a lady from another state wrote, "If I ever pass by, here I want to give you a hug. You taught me to respect myself." Margaret carefully folded the letter and placed it with the others, already planning to write a response. Sometimes that was enough for the day to make sense, knowing that even from afar she was connected to other women who also chose to rise. It was as if, unintentionally, she had created a silent chain of courage. On a particularly cold day, while sitting by the fireplace with a cup of hot chocolate in her hands, Margaret reflected on everything she had built since she was expelled from her own home. She thought about the paths she had walked without knowing where they would lead, the fears she had faced without an audience, the days when she felt like giving up but still got up, and she thought about how it all began with a betrayal, a raw, unexpected pain that dismantled her structure. But that same pain also opened a gap for what would come next. It was strange to think that so many good things had emerged precisely from the moment when everything seemed to collapse. And maybe it was just like that. Some constructions only happen after the collapse. Margaret looked at the lit fireplace, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and smiled. She had survived, and more than that, she had lived. On a clear January morning, Margaret decided to visit a bookstore she had only known through photos. It was located a few hours away, in a charming little town surrounded by mountains. She took the bus very early, with a small backpack, her notebook, and a red scarf wrapped around her neck. Upon arriving, she was greeted with a hot coffee and a welcoming atmosphere. Wooden shelves, a warm yellow light, and the unmistakable smell of aged paper. She spent hours there, leafing through unknown titles, jotting down references, and chatting with the bookseller about memoirs and women's narratives. She bought 3 books, all written by authors who had turned pain into language. On her way out, she wrote in her notebook, "We heal when we discover that we are not alone." On the bus ride back, she watched the fields passing slowly by the window, as if time had slowed down so she could think. And she thought. She thought about how she had spent her entire life blaming herself for not being enough, for no longer being able to do more, for not receiving in return what she gave with so much faith. Now, she understood that the mistake wasn't in her. It was in the imbalance of exchange, in the absence of recognition, in the normalization of emotional exploitation. Margaret rested her head against the glass and let the landscape pass. She no longer made grand plans. She dreamed of good days, of health, of sincere people nearby, and above all of the continuation of the peace she had built with so much effort. It was a kind of happiness that didn't appear in photos nor arouse envy, but that, inside, filled every space. Not long after, she received an invitation to participate in a documentary about stories of overcoming in old age. The project was independent, led by 2 young filmmakers who had been following her blog for months. Margaret thought a lot before accepting. She didn't want to reopen old wounds or turn her story into a spectacle. But when she talked with the 2 directors, she realized there was truth and sensitivity there. They didn't want to exploit the drama. They wanted to document the power of rebuilding. And that, she knew, was something she could offer. Yeah. Filming took place over 3 weeks, always respecting her limits, capturing everyday scenes, her watering plants, organizing the letters she received, writing in her notebook, laughing with Judith, listening to Clara. It was simple, but real, and perhaps for that reason, so beautiful. The documentary was released at a regional festival and received honorable mentions for the delicacy of its perspective and the depth of its narrative. Margaret was invited to a special session where the audience could watch the film and then talk with her. Sitting in front of dozens of people, she felt a flutter in her stomach that she hadn't felt since the first time she spoke in public. But once the film began, she calmed down. Seeing her life on screen, the pain, the choices, the silences, she felt something hard to explain. It wasn't pride, nor vanity. It was the feeling that everything finally made sense, that every step, even the most painful ones, had led her to this moment. At the end of the session, she received a standing ovation. She didn't cry. She simply smiled and thanked them with a nod. She knew that this moment wasn't a climax. It was just another quiet chapter in a life that was finally hers. In the days following the documentary's premiere, Margaret received a flood of messages, not only from people who identified with her story, but also from sons and daughters who began to see their mothers in a different light. "Thank you for showing me the side of my mother I never knew," wrote one young woman. "After watching your film, I called her for the first time in months. Margaret read each message carefully, moved. She didn't answer them all, but she kept the ones that touched her the most. It was as if, little by little, life was giving her back everything that had once been denied: listening, recognition, humanity. And even if these gestures couldn't change the past, they made the present lighter, fairer, truer. One morning, as she opened the window and felt the cold air enter the house, Margaret was certain that she no longer needed to prove anything. There was nothing pending anymore. She wasn't expecting letters from Eisen, nor dramatic turnarounds. If one day he understood everything, great. If not, that was fine too. Margaret had freed herself from expectations. And that freedom, silent and deep, was what sustained her days now. She would continue writing, planting, and welcoming anyone who crossed her path with sincerity. Not to fill a void, but because it made sense, because it was her choice. The woman who was once discarded as a burden was now a reference. The one who cried hidden away in her room was now being heard out loud. Margaret didn't want to go back in time. She didn't want to change anything, because it was precisely by living through it all that she finally learned to live for herself. On one of the last pages of her new book, Margaret wrote something she had never been able to say before, not even to herself. To forgive is not to forget, it is to remember without carrying. That sentence came after a dream in which she saw Eisen as a small child, playing with a kite in the backyard of the old house. In the dream, she only watched, without interfering, without chasing after him. And when she woke up, she understood that that was all that remained. To look at the story with respect, but without the obligation to fix what isn't solely her responsibility. There was no more pain there, only acceptance, and a deep compassion, not for him, but for the woman she had been for so long, exhausted, devoted, invisible. It was for her that Margaret now wrote, for all the versions that endured in silence while the world demanded too much. When she finished the book, she decided not to hold a launch or an event. She would simply send it to anyone interested, as a gift. The dedication on the first page read, "For those who learned to choose themselves late, but not too late." That was the tone of her story, not one of bitterness but of reunion. She kept the first copy for herself with a note inside, "You made it," written by hand, with the same blue pen she used to write notes for Eisen in her childhood. This time, the note was for her. It was a kind of seal, an affectionate signature. Margaret closed the book carefully, placed it on the shelf among her favorite authors, and went out for a walk. The wind was cold, the sky clear, and the village quiet. It was just another ordinary day. And for her, that was all she desired now. Ordinary days, lived in peace. That night, before going to sleep, Margaret sat on the porch with a blanket on her shoulders and a cup of tea in her hands. She looked at the starry sky, the same one she had often observed in silence, longing for answers. But now there were no more questions. There was only the present, simple, calm, sufficient. She thought about everything she had lived, the sacrifices, the expulsion, the public pain, the new beginning. She thought about the women she had met, the words she had written, the seeds she had planted in solid ground. She was no longer the woman who endured. She was the one who chose. And that daily choice, discreet and powerful, was her way of resisting and loving herself. Farol jumped onto her lap, and together they stayed there in silence, as if the world were finally in its right place. Before turning off the light, she wrote one more phrase in her notebook. "I didn't save myself alone, but I was the one who decided to start." She closed the cover gently, arranged the pillows, and went to sleep feeling calm. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she didn't need to know. She had built a home within herself where fear, guilt, or loneliness no longer fit. Margaret slept with a gentle smile on her face, the same one she now carried every day. And if someone asked years later how she overcame it all, the answer would be simple. She stopped expecting from others what she had learned to give to herself. And that was how she finally found the peace she always deserved. If this story inspired you in any way, like the video, comment on what touched you most, and don't forget to subscribe.